Around 16 years ago, I was at a fancy banquet and there was a function band playing. Very high-end function band, one of the most established ones in Maine, who had been around for ages. And the guitar player, who was the lead of the band, was playing a probably $6,000 or $7,000 PRS guitar into what looked like a vintage Fender Tweed amp, and the tone was absolutely unbelievable. So during one of their breaks, I kind of snuck up towards the stage, took a look at it. It looked like one of those old TV front Tweed amps, and it wasn't a vintage Fender. It was a Peavey Delta Blues. What's up, everyone? Welcome to the channel and welcome to this demo and review of this discontinued, unsung classic tube amplifier. This is the Peavey Delta Blues, which is, in my opinion, one of the, if not the greatest working player tube amplifiers of all time. And the story of this amplifier is really, really interesting. These go all the way back to the 90s. Now, in the early 90s, Peavey, like many other companies, were trying to capitalize on a resurgence on interest in roots music, specifically blues, which came from a backlash to the excess of the 1980s. Hard rock turning into ridiculous glam hairband stuff. Pop music was becoming heavily synthesized and electronic-based. And out of that came many, many artists who were going way, way back and getting rootsy. Obviously, blues hit a huge stride, and at the tail end of it, you had the height of Stevie Ray Vaughan's popularity before his untimely death. Well, companies like Peavey and Fender were trying to make good on this. Now, there were also many, many young rockers who were trying to make their way, so the idea of having a budget-friendly tube amp line was very alluring. Now, Peavey were always known for making USA-made, budget-friendly gear. And in the early 90s, they were working with an amp designer named James Brown. Not that one, that one. James Brown is, I think, one of the most underappreciated amp designers. He is responsible for many, many amplifiers, including the Peavey Classic series, the 5150 Van Halen series. He would later work with Custom, Schecter, Keisel. He has designed many amplifiers that you probably know and love, and his designs are fantastic. He's a really, really great amp builder, known for usable features, very punchy tone, all across the board, really good stuff. Well, Peavey in 1993 came out with the Classic 30, which is, of course, another one of the greatest working players amps that are out there. This is the same year that Fender came out with the Blues Deluxe and Blues DeVille. Peavey decided to expand on the Classic 30 and make it something with more features, but also really go directly for the blues crowd. So in 1994, the year later, they released the Peavey Delta Blues. Now, the original Delta Blues had the old-fashioned block logo on the front. It still had the 1950 style TV cab. They were only offered in a 115 configuration. Now, notably, the difference between the Delta Blues and the Classic 30 was that the Delta Blues had the 15-inch speaker and it had optical tremolo. Now, both of these amplifiers used EL84s as opposed to your sort of more classic 6V6 or 6L6. This was also common of a lot of amplifiers in the 90s because EL84s were much more widely available for much cheaper, so they really suited a budget-friendly amp line. They also, however, created a little bit of a different tone. These are American-sounding circuits, but with tubes that are more common in British amplifiers, which give them this slightly upper mid-rangey harmonic thing going on and a very, very distinct tone. Now, these amps are known, again, for their versatility and features. You've got your clean channel, you've got your drive channel, you also have a built-in clean boost, and one of the things I love about it is it really is just a boost. It gives you more volume as opposed to some other amplifiers where the boost also boosts the EQ and the gain and all this and that. This is really just a volume boost. It has one of the best sounding reverbs on any budget amp that I've ever heard, and even competing with some pretty high-end amps, and it has the optical tremolo, as well as foot switching capability. And the Peavey Delta Blues stayed pretty standard up until the late 90s, when in 99 they started to offer a second speaker configuration. You could get it in the 115 or in a 210 configuration. Now, along with the new speaker configuration, they also started offering it in a black tweed covering. There wouldn't be really any other major changes until 2006, when they abandoned the vintage sort of Fender style logo and went with their Peavey round logo, which was on the front. These amps were phenomenal. People loved them. They were out and about. They were, again, made in the USA, good quality, a lot of features at a working player's price. You'd see them on backlines an awful lot. I remember playing Peavey Classic amps, whether it was a Delta Blues or something else, on backlines in clubs in the mid-2000s into the early 2010s. Now, while these are awesome, they had one kind of glaring thing about them that wasn't necessarily as great. In order to keep the budget down on these, they developed this really unique sort of C-shaped circuit board, which was 3 circuit boards that were kind of connected in a C or a U pattern, and it made them very, very difficult to work on. So engineers kind of notoriously are not a fan of working on these because they can break apart and be fragile and sort of be finicky. That being said, there are many engineers out there who know these amps because they were so popular, so they know how to work on them even though they're a pain to work on. Now, things stayed pretty status quo for almost the next 10 years. In the mid-2010s, things went crazy sideways backwards for Peavey. In 2015, Peavey moved their manufacturing to China, which for a lot of players, obviously a lot of people have issues with that, some people don't have issues with that. That's a contentious subject in and of itself. But the trouble for Peavey was twofold. Before moving their production overseas, Peavey was featured on Undercover Boss, and immediately afterwards, they closed one of their major US manufacturing plants, which led to a lot of layoffs, and the whole thing really looked bad for the company. So now you've lost one of their major selling features, that these are budget-friendly, made in the US. The company does not look good, and things sort of progressively fell apart from there. The 210 was discontinued in 2019, and the 115, the Classic, the one that had been around for nearly 30 years, was discontinued in 2022. That was the end of the Peavey Delta Blues. Now, nowadays, there is a Peavey Classic 20 that's out. These are still manufactured overseas. Peavey is still going, but they really kind of lost out on the glory days of the 90s and the early 2000s, when they were making one of the most popular and successful working players amps around. Again, whether it's the Delta Blues, or I will also give nod to the Classic 30 on this one. The Classic 50s are also great. The Classic 50s were offered in a 212 or a 410 configuration, very, very similar to the Fender DeVille. Those were bigger and heavier and never seemed to really give you that much more than the 30, so those weren't quite as popular, but if you find them, the tone is just as great. These all sound really awesome, and what's great about them is the range of gain. This one obviously being called Delta Blues, you might kind of expect a certain sound. Well, it's got a pristine clean, as I mentioned, a fantastic reverb, and the drive can really go from a subtle bluesy all the way up to a pretty serious, almost more like a distortion kind of sound. So right now with this one, now this is a post 2006, this is made in the USA, so this is before it was moved to China. This is a post 2006 when they have the Peavey round logo. As you can see, it's a 210 with their famous Blue Marvel speakers. We're going to dive back in and first just listen to the amazing clean tone that this offers. Now let's have a listen to some of the effects. We're going to start with the reverb because, again, the reverb on this is just absolutely unbelievable. That is better than any Fender budget line reverb has ever been, and I will die on that hill. I've played a lot of budget-friendly Fender amps, and you know, many of them are fine. I don't have a problem with them. I like a lot of them. You've seen me do videos of them. This reverb's better, and it's not close. I can't think of a single budget-friendly Fender amp that has a reverb that sounds anywhere near this good. Not only that, but this one has a convincing tremolo. It's an optical tremolo. And if we're being honest, you know, when you talk about the Fender Blues series, the fact that they negated to put tremolo on it, I think, is a massive disadvantage when Peavey was ahead of the game here. Now the tremolo has a nice kind of chop to it, which also can work at heavier levels with gain for kind of a percussive rhythm sound. So that's a great segue getting into some of the drive tones of this amplifier. Now, this, like many other Peaveys, has a pre and a post, and it's kind of like, the pre is kind of like your basic gain, whereas the post is more like your volume. You can dial them in a lot of different ways to get a lot of different flavors of gain, and when you mix that with the 3-band EQ, there are many ways you can shape this. So we're going to start from subtle, and then we're going to get to a little bit more raucous. So let's go in with a Stratocaster at a lighter gain level for really hearkening to what its name evokes, some kind of a blues tone. One of the things that I have noticed about James Brown's amplifier designs is they have a very, very tight sounding EQ in a good way. It works great on stage. So the bass, very, very tight bass, no loosey, flubby, boxy woofiness. Same with the mids. You can crank the mids and you get a really nice kind of punch without it sounding boxy. And the treble, any amp with treble, you got to be careful with it. Stage volumes, but the treble is never, I mean, it's harsh when you get loud, but not in a way that I would describe it as harsh comparatively to other amps. It's a sweet sounding treble that's dialed in really nicely. So particularly with the guitar, again, like a Stratocaster, that has very, very clear sounding pickups, you can turn the bass up and turn the gain up and just get a really massive, but still very articulate tone. All right, now let's hear it with some humbuckers, and today I'm using a Gibson ES-137 Classic loaded with Seymour Duncan Seth Lover pickups. So again, you can really hear the punch and that sort of upper mid-range harmonic richness of the EL84s. It almost gives you, at higher gain levels, a little bit of British character. So in a way, it's kind of like a hybrid amp. You've got American style and American voicing, but again, a little bit of that British punchiness and harmonic richness to it. Now, there's one feature that I haven't mentioned yet that is really wonderful, which is an effects loop. And that allows you obviously to put your time-based or your modulation-based, if you like, effects in after the preamp so that they don't get colored or overpowered by the preamp. Now, you heard that already a little bit at the beginning when I did the intro jam for my lead tone with the Stratocaster. I had a Berserker Pedals Hydronaut delay going into the effects loop, which I'm going to do again in a minute here. I'm also going to then kick on a Wampler Belle to show you how well this takes overdrives, because even though the drive channel on this is phenomenal, it also is a perfect pedal platform. It loves pedals. So let's have a listen to how this sounds using effects pedals. you can still typically find these amps used for anywhere from 400 on the low end to 600 on the high end, depending on the year and the condition. They're everywhere, and they're worth knowing how to use because they're great to pick up if you need a solid gigging amp, a backup, or honestly, even more than that. I would have no qualms with using this at a recording session for a bigger show or whatnot. I really like these amps, and every time I plug into them, I'm honestly surprised at how good they actually sound. And that goes for all the amplifiers in Peavey's Classic series, whether it's the 30, the 50. I've owned a 30 and a 50 before, and anytime you kind of get rid of them, another one pops up on the market. So there's something, like I said, that's worth knowing how to use. So let us know in the comments, do you have any experience with the Peavey Delta Blues or the other amps in this series? What do you think of them? I'm Jack Fossett. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.